St. Patrick has long been recognised as the patron saint of Ireland, a man of great piety who eradicated snakes from the island and had a fondness for shamrocks. But have you ever wondered how many of the stories about him are real and how many are myths? Well, in today's video from History Calling, we're going to put the sources to the test and ask just what do we know about St. Patrick. Stick around until the end and I'll also explain why St. Patrick's Day is celebrated on the 17th of March and where those snake and shamrock stories come from. There are only two sources which actually date to St. Patrick's lifetime and tell us about his life, and both were written by the man himself whilst he was living in Ireland. The first is an undated letter he wrote to the soldiers of a man named Coroticus. This letter is commonly called the Epistula, as this is the Latin word for letter, and in it he criticised and excommunicated these soldiers for killing and enslaving some of the Irish whom Patrick had converted to Christianity. The second, lengthier document is called his Confession, which he dates simply to his old age and which gives far greater detail about his life. Here's what they have to say about his story. For a start, if you've ever wondered, was St. Patrick Irish? The answer is no. He was born in Roman Britain to a man named Calpurnius, who was a decurio, which was a local official in a town or village, and a deacon, which is a religious office. Calpurnius's father was called Petitus and was a priest. We know nothing about Patrick's mother, though we do know from his father and grandfather's occupations that the family were at least third-generation Christians by the time Patrick came along. The dates of his birth and death are unclear, but he most likely lived between the 4th century AD and the early 6th century. This estimate is based on references within the Confession and the Epistula to events happening within Roman Britain at the time and on his writing style, in particular some 4th century religious texts he seems to be referencing. Popular estimates for his birth and death are around 420 and 490 AD respectively, but again I stress these are later estimates and Patrick himself provided no dates. There is a popular story that he came to Ireland in 432 AD, but this is based on a faulty source, a hagiography of Patrick written in the 7th century by a man named Muracue. A hagiography is a life of a saint, but it frequently isn't based on original sources, or it takes great liberties with them and often tells us more about what the writer wanted the saint to be like than what they actually were like. Muracue wrote that another missionary, a man named Palladius, who we know from other sources had come to Ireland in 431, soon left, and then Patrick arrived. The Irish Annals, written centuries after Patrick's death, therefore just add a year on to the known date of Palladius's arrival and apparently swift departure, and say that Patrick showed up in 432 AD. There's absolutely no reliable evidence to support this though, and Patrick's writings don't even mention Palladius. What Patrick does tell us is that he came from a fairly well-off family, for his father had a small estate near the village of Banavem to Bernier and owned slaves. Today it's unknown where this village was, though some have assumed it must have been near the western coast of Britain, perhaps in modern-day Wales, as at about the age of 16, Patrick, along with thousands of others taken at around the same time, was kidnapped directly from the estate and taken into slavery in Ireland. Patrick saw his enslavement as a punishment from God for not being a good enough Christian, but also attributed this period of his life to his religious awakening, saying in the Confession that God, quote, had mercy on the ignorance of my youth and looked after me. He didn't consider himself particularly well educated, calling himself unlearned in the Epistula and writing in the Confession that I have not been a student like other men who in the very best manner have drunk equally in law and sacred letters, end quote. He blamed this lack of education in part on his youth when he was taken captive. Modern scholars have challenged this though, pointing out that he spoke Latin and whatever the native language of the area in which he was raised was, perhaps early Welsh, and that his writings indicate his knowledge of other churchmen's writings such as St. Augustine. This learning may well have been acquired in later life though, as would his acquisition of the Irish language. Whilst in Ireland as a slave, he worked as a shepherd, saying that he prayed constantly during this period, even hundreds of times a day, and grew fond of the Irish. Where exactly he was held is unknown, though he speaks of a wood and a mountain being nearby. One day he heard a voice telling him that it would soon be time to return to his homeland. Soon after, another voice told him that his ship was ready, but that it was 200 miles away in an area unknown to Patrick. It was shortly after this that he fled from his slave master, who he had been with for 6 years, and began the journey back to Britain. Much ink has been spilt on trying to use these clues to figure out where exactly Patrick was living during his 6 years, with the results usually placing him somewhere in County Mayo. However, as Thomas O'Loughlin has said, this exercise is ultimately a futile effort, because Patrick wouldn't have had the kind of firm grasp of Ireland's geography that we have today, and may have taken a very circuitous route to get from where he had been living to a port, rather than going in a straight 200-mile long line. When he reached the coast, the boat he wanted to take was about to leave, and he was initially refused passage on it by the pagan sailors. However, he writes that as he walked away from them, praying to God for assistance, they suddenly changed their minds and agreed to take him on board. The voyage lasted 3 days and was followed by 28 days on foot through what Patrick called a desert. This may have been in Britain or even the western side of Gaul, which is modern-day France, Belgium and the Netherlands. Indeed, the journey was so long and difficult that the group began to starve. His companions asked Patrick to pray for help, and he tells us in the confession that when he did so, a herd of swine soon appeared, which the men were able to kill and eat. They then camped for 2 days while they recovered their strength, and Patrick says the incident greatly improved him in their eyes and turned them to Christianity. 14 days later, just as their food ran out, they reached civilization. Patrick was then taken captive again. However, he writes that a vision from God told him that this captivity would last only 2 months, and sure enough, after 60 days he was free again, though he provides no details as to how this happened. He goes on to say that after a few years he was reunited with his parents in Britain again and became a deacon like his father, though he doesn't explain when or where this training occurred. He suffered a considerable fall from grace, however, when he was charged by his superiors with some unknown sin committed 30 years earlier when he was around 15, and he was ultimately rejected by them because of it, despite one of his friends attempting to argue his case at the inquiry for him. Patrick is very light with details of the chronology of this episode, though. He was obviously in his mid-40s by this point, but says that when the case came before his superiors, he wasn't there, nor was he even in Britain. He only heard what had happened later on. He may have already been back in Ireland, for despite his parents having begged him to stay with them, at some point he received another vision in which he says he saw a man named Victoricus, who appeared to be from Ireland and who gave him a letter to read. When he did so, he writes, "I thought I heard the voice of those around the wood of Fouclut." Again, scholars have wondered where this was, but we don't know, which is close to the Western Sea, probably the Atlantic. It was as if they were shouting with one voice, "O holy boy, we beg you to come again and walk among us." Patrick was touched by this vision and determined to return to Ireland as a bishop to spread Christianity amongst its people. Having done so, he writes that he endured many insults from unbelievers and people who did not want him there, and called himself, quote, "an alien among the barbarians" in the Epistola. Ultimately, he was successful in his mission, though, according to the confession, for recently, what a change! They have become a prepared people of the Lord, and they are now called the sons of God. According to the confession, Patrick's work included ordaining clergy and baptising many thousands of Irish men and women all over Ireland, often enduring great danger and discomfort in doing so, and even being taken captive again and robbed, along with his travelling companions, some of whom he says were the sons of kings. He attributed his release and the restoration of his goods to God's intervention, however, though he continued to expect, quote, "to be killed or waylaid or taken into slavery or assaulted in some other way every day." Nevertheless, his actions seem to have attracted some criticism in his homeland, for he admits that one of the reasons he is writing the confession is to defend himself against charges, apparently from the church in Britain, that he has used his position for personal gain. It was also at some point during this second stay in Ireland that the events which led Patrick to write the Epistola occurred, when the soldiers of Coroticus cut down and cruelly put to the sword, to use Patrick's phrase, a number of people he had just baptized, taking others prisoner and refusing to release them when Patrick requested they do so. This is what led him to excommunicate those soldiers. Despite the difficulties of life in Ireland and his admission in both the Epistola and the Confession that he was homesick for Britain and his family and for his friends in Gaul, which might suggest this is where he trained as a deacon, he believed that it was God's will that he stay on the island until his death, and that all his missionary efforts there might be in vain if he left. He therefore remained until he died, writing at the end of the Confession of how he would like to be remembered, and saying, I now pray for anyone who believes in and fears God, who may perchance come upon this writing which Patrick, the sinner and the unlearned one, wrote in Ireland. I wrote it so that no one might say that whatever little I did or anything I made visible according to God's pleasure was done through ignorance. Rather, you should judge the situation and let it be truly believed that it was a gift from God. And this is my declaration before I die. This is as far as the original sources about Patrick's life take us. Later works written during the 7th century have asserted that he died in Saul, County Down, which is now in Northern Ireland, and that he was buried in the town of Downpatrick. There is nothing to confirm or deny this either way. A tombstone at the church in Downpatrick with Patrick's name on it actually dates to the early 20th century, as do a number of other relics supposedly associated with him, including this shrine of the hand of St. Patrick and this so-called bell of St. Patrick, though there were earlier versions of these relics created in the 15th century. You may have noticed there's been no talk of snakes or shamrocks in Patrick's writings, so where did these stories come from? Well, the story of him ridding Ireland of its snakes comes from a 12th century life of Patrick written by an English chronicler called Jocelyn of Furness. The story also appears in the work of one of his contemporaries, Gerald of Wales. Remember, though, that they were writing approximately 600 years after Patrick's death. As for shamrocks, the origins of this myth are even worse, for the earliest reference to him using this plant to explain the concept of the Trinity of God, Jesus and the Holy Spirit actually dates to 1727, over 1,000 years after he lived. Last but not least, the reason the 17th of March is celebrated all over the world as St. Patrick's Day is because it's believed to be the date he died. This belief stems from some 7th century liturgical calendars, which are like church calendars that list when different religious feast days are. They give the 17th of March as his death date, as does a note from the 9th century Book of Armagh, now housed in Trinity College, Dublin. It may or may not be true. Well, that's the story of St. Patrick, along with the answers to a few of the most popular legends about him. I hope you found this little detour back to 5th century Ireland enjoyable. Let me know in the comments section below if any of this has altered your thoughts on either St. Patrick or even how St. Patrick's Day is celebrated. I'll be back next week with a new video. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications switched on so that you don't miss it. And until then, keep learning.